Hello my lovely people, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Jane. This is the first time that you're laying your eyes on me. Thank you so much for stopping by. My return subscribers, I love you. African Union. Hey God, the African Union has finally, they waited for, first of all, they gave Niger, Mali, Mali, and Burkina Faso 1 year, said it like a warning, 1 year to give them chance to come back to wherever they belong, to ECOWAS. And now, after 1 year has passed, these people are moving forward instead of coming. So African Union, nation or union, whatever they call them, they carry themselves, they send delegates to Burkina Faso so they can go and meet the man of the hour, the man of the year, the man that cares about the people, the youngest president in the world. They went to meet him so they can discuss. They're like, hey, what are we doing? Thanks to Ahmed Bola Tinubu that is scaling everything, that is making everything. Even somebody said, ECOWAS have never had it bad. ECOWAS have never had it bad until INEC select the president to show up as the president. Hey God! But the INEC select president is not why I am here. I am here because the African Union went to Burkina Faso to go and dialogue with him, to ask him, okay, Oga, we have seen what you are saying. We have seen where you are going. Let us sit down and let us discuss. Maybe you can borrow some of your brain and put in ours. So let us see how they did it. Please, I need you to listen to this video. I beg, the owner of this channel, I am glued in his channel. I am watching like no man business. Please watch, and as you watch, you share, go to his channel too and subscribe if you want to know more about what is happening in our African continent. From me to you, thank you so much for watching. Please enjoy the video. Bye-bye.
The African Union just landed in Burkina Faso. No press fanfare, no military convoy, just a quiet envoy with a message nobody fully understands. But why this sudden silence after years of watching from afar? Why now? And what exactly are they listening for? Let's find out. They didn't bring sanctions. They didn't threaten suspension. They didn't even come with an official roadmap. The African Union's decision to send Tete Antonio, Angola's top diplomat, to Burkina Faso wasn't the usual loud diplomacy Africa has grown accustomed to. Instead, they came in low, quiet, and curious. A move that left observers confused and junta leaders intrigued. But there's nothing casual about a listening mission. In geopolitics, silence is often louder than war drums. And when Antonio sat down with Ibrahim Traoré in Ouagadougou, he wasn't there to instruct. He was there to absorb, to gather, to report back. That's where the real weight of this mission lies. Because when the African Union listens, it usually means one thing. It doesn't know what to do yet. For years, the AU followed the standard script: condemn coups, demand elections, threaten expulsion. But Sahel tore that script to pieces. The coups in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso weren't followed by chaos and collapse. They were followed by a wave of popular support, regional defiance, and a new hunger for sovereignty that no summit could contain. Now, with Burkina Faso openly rejecting ECOWAS and pivoting away from Western partners, the AU's old playbook looks less like policy and more like noise. So Antonio didn't come to enforce anything. He came to hear what the new Sahel wants, and more importantly, what it doesn't. Inside the closed-door meetings, sources say the conversations were less about deadlines and elections, and more about long-term vision. What does post-Western Africa look like? What kind of role, if any, can the AU play in a region that's rewriting the rules on sovereignty, defense, and diplomacy? Traoré's administration made one thing clear. They're not interested in lectures from Addis Ababa. However, they are open to partnership, provided it respects their autonomy, their new alliances, and their demand for solutions rooted in African realities, rather than Western templates. And that's where the AU finds itself walking a tightrope. On one side, it's under pressure from international donors to uphold norms. On the other hand, it faces a rising bloc of African states demanding the freedom to define those norms on their terms. The listening mission is not a solution. It's a signal. The AU is trying to understand this new language of African defiance before it becomes the continent's dominant dialect. But don't mistake this listening for passivity. It's strategic reconnaissance. Antonio wasn't just collecting opinions, he was mapping out pressure points, decoding local ambitions, and identifying where the AU can still be useful without becoming obsolete. There's talk, unconfirmed but credible, that the AU is considering non-traditional support for Sahel states, logistical aid without conditions, intelligence sharing networks between member states, even emergency humanitarian channels that bypass Western bottlenecks. These ideas weren't floated in press releases. They whispered behind closed doors. That's why Antonio came to learn what could work in practice, not just in theory. This isn't the AU trying to reclaim control. It's the AU trying to avoid irrelevance. The message behind the silence is this: tell us what future you're building, and we'll decide if we can help, or at least not get in the way. Because if the AU doesn't evolve with the Sahel, it won't just lose influence in Burkina Faso. It will lose the mandate of the very continent it claims to represent. And that leads us to an even more difficult question. If the AU is just now starting to listen, what exactly is it hearing? And what does it mean for the rest of Africa when one region stops asking for permission? You don't fly into a country like Burkina Faso, sit across from a military leader in fatigues, and simply listen, unless what you're hearing is so urgent, so volatile, that pretending to understand from afar is no longer an option. And make no mistake, what the African Union is hearing from the ground isn't just another tale of insurgency or political instability. It's a manifesto, a warning, a regional declaration that the status quo is dead, and anyone still clinging to it is either deaf, blind, or colonial. Blind, the AU came to listen because something is erupting under the surface in the Sahel. But what it heard is far more unsettling than it expected. A new ideology, spreading quietly but fiercely. One that says Africa should no longer compromise with weakness dressed as diplomacy. One that says Western patronage is not protection, it's a leash. One that frames self-rule not as a slogan, but as a battlefield. Inside those meetings, Traoré and his inner circle didn't speak like rebels. They spoke like builders. The tone wasn't defensive, it was declarative. The message wasn't, help us stabilize. It was, get ready for what's coming. Burkina Faso isn't asking for advice. It's laying out terms. And those terms don't leave much room for institutions that insist on outdated models of governance, elections for funding deals, or peace processes managed from European capitals. The junta's belief system, and increasingly, the belief system of many in the Sahel, is that liberation doesn't come from ballots shaped by foreign interests. It comes from the control of land, food, information, and arms. And that is the system they're now building, piece by piece, and unapologetically. The AU, once a proud messenger of Pan-Africanism, now finds itself struggling to comprehend this radical new vision of sovereignty. Not because it disagrees in principle, but because it never imagined the people demanding it would tear up the rulebook so completely. From the villages of Kaya to the streets of Ouagadougou, the mood has changed. Civil society leaders, youth organizers, and even traditional chiefs are talking in a new language. They're not begging for reforms. They're demanding results. The usual calls for international mediation are being replaced by bold experiments. State-owned gold refineries, military-run food distribution programs, and youth-driven vocational networks replacing foreign NGOs. And behind all of this, a shared understanding that listening must come before loyalty, that any alliance, even with the AU, must be earned, not inherited. This is what Antonio was hearing. And this is why the mission was so quietly urgent. Because what's forming in the Sahel is not just a rebellion against foreign domination. It's a test of African unity itself. The AU now has to decide whether it will embrace this raw, chaotic surge of independence or treat it like a threat to continental cohesion. And that's the dangerous part. If the AU misreads this movement, if it treats it as a passing phase or a problem to be managed, it risks alienating an entire generation of African nations determined to define development on their terms. Even worse, it risks becoming a symbol of betrayal. The very body meant to defend African sovereignty could become, at least in the eyes of the Sahel, a bureaucracy clinging to the past, afraid to let Africa evolve beyond its comfort zones. But there's something else the AU is hearing too. Something not said in press statements but murmured among officials, soldiers, and activists alike. Fear. Not fear of war, but of abandonment. Fear that if this new African path fails, no one will be there to catch them. That without AU support, the Sahel may win its sovereignty but lose its soul to warlords, resource grabs, or opportunistic outsiders eager to fill the vacuum. That's why Antonio's mission mattered. It wasn't just about observation, it was about recognition. A silent, unofficial that this uprising of new African thought isn't a threat, it's a mirror. It shows the AU what it could become, but also what it might lose if it doesn't adapt fast. So now the AU has heard the new voice of the Sahel. The next question is, can it respond without choking on its traditions? Or will this be the moment when the center of African power shifts away from institutions and into the hands of revolutionary states willing to burn old bridges to build new futures? What the AU heard in Burkina Faso wasn't just a cry for dignity, it was a blueprint for a new Africa. And now, for the first time in decades, the center of gravity on the continent is shifting. Not toward the polished halls of Addis Ababa, or the towering skyscrapers of Lagos, or even the banks of the Nile, but toward the dust-choked borderlands of the Sahel, where broken promises are being melted down and reforged into something raw, sovereign, and fiercely unrecognizable. This ideological wildfire didn't start with a coup. It started with exhaustion. Years of broken aid promises, foreign troops with unclear missions, drone strikes that missed their targets, and elections that delivered nothing but more poverty. All of it fermented into a silent rage. And when that rage boiled over in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it wasn't chaos that followed. It was construction. These countries didn't just reject ECOWAS, they rejected the entire post-independence African order, one based on externally defined legitimacy, Western funding cycles, and slow-moving bureaucracies masquerading as unity. And instead of descending into anarchy, they formed something far more dangerous to the status quo: the Alliance of Sahel States. This wasn't just a military or diplomatic alliance. It was a breakaway vision, a shared declaration that Africa's borders may remain the same, but its power centers don't have to. In this new vision, sovereignty is measured by control over your currency, your own resources, and your own information systems. It's why these states are working on independent gold refineries, cutting ties with French-backed currencies, building their food supply chains, and investing in African-led security coalitions that don't need green lights from Paris or Washington. But here's the twist. This isn't isolationism. It's a continental redefinition. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré aren't calling for a smaller Africa. They're calling for a reconnected one, just not through the usual pipelines. They want South-South diplomacy, BRICS partnerships, agricultural self-sufficiency, and an African Union that behaves less like a diplomat and more like a defense shield. This is why the AU's listening mission wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about the political earthquake spreading outwards, tremor by tremor. Chad feels it, Guinea feels it, even Senegal, historically a pillar of Western-backed governance, now hears the rumble beneath its feet. Because what the Sahel Alliance is proving is this: you don't need the West's blessing to lead your people. You only need control of the essentials: land, minerals, food, and guns, and the loyalty of a population that has seen every other promise fail. And the AU? It's caught between tectonic plates. On one side, traditional member states are urging caution, peacekeeping, and multilateralism. On the other hand, a rising bloc that sees those very principles as chains disguised as principles. What makes this moment so volatile is that both visions are deeply African and deeply incompatible. If the AU tries to neutralize the Sahel bloc, it may fracture the very unity it was built to defend. But if it embraces them too easily, it risks alienating long-standing members and foreign partners who still hold the purse strings. So the real question is this: who defines what it means to be African now? Is it the institutions in suits and ties? Or the young captains in camo fatigues drilling recruits under Sahelian skies? If the AU doesn't offer an answer soon, the Sahel might just answer for them by becoming the new model for post-Western African governance. A model that doesn't wait for UN approval. A model that doesn't ask for debt relief. A model that tells its own story, on its frequencies, with its boots on its ground. And that's no longer a hypothetical. That's already happening. So where does the African Union go from here? If it wants to matter in this new order, it must do more than listen. It must participate, or risk becoming a relic of a past the Sahel is now tearing down. But can the AU evolve fast enough? Or will the future of African leadership be decided without it, in war rooms and wheat fields it can no longer reach? The African Union was built to unify, but now it faces a force it was never designed to confront, a union of defiance. The alliance of Sahel states isn't just carving its path, it's daring the rest of Africa to follow. And behind closed doors in Addis Ababa, a quiet question is beginning to haunt the walls. What if the AU is no longer the center of Africa's future? The Sahel's rebellion isn't just military, it's psychological. It has exposed the deep rot in Africa's post-colonial political architecture. For years, the AU has relied on the assumption that its authority is sacred, that its resolutions matter, that its presence alone guarantees relevance. But in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, those assumptions are being shredded, not through press releases, but through action. When the Sahel trio cut ties with ECOWAS, they didn't ask the AU for permission. When they expelled French forces, didn't consult any African bloc. When they began reshaping their economic systems and forming their defense pact, they didn't wait for regional endorsement. They just moved, fast, coordinated, unapologetically. And what did the AU do? It watched. It issued statements, it convened meetings, it made gestures, but gestures don't shield villagers from bullets. They don't restore burned-out farms or stop children from disappearing into insurgent camps. That's the AU's existential crisis. It's being outpaced, not just by insurgents or superpowers, but by its member states acting outside its orbit. In Ouagadougou, the very fact that a listening mission was necessary reveals something deeper. The AU no longer has the full trust of the states it claims to represent. Traoré didn't invite Antonio to rubber stamp AU presence. He allowed him in to test whether the Union still understands the terrain it's supposed to govern. What Antonio walked into wasn't hostility, it was irrelevance, politely dressed as diplomacy. Traoré welcomed him, yes, but there was no ceremony, no grand parade, because Burkina Faso doesn't need validation from Addis Ababa anymore. It has moved into a different political logic, one where legitimacy comes from results, not resolutions. And that's the model spreading like wildfire across other parts of the continent. Look at the cracks forming elsewhere. In Eastern Africa, Rwanda and the DRC operate like rivals inside the same room. In Southern Africa, tensions are brewing between reformist leaders and entrenched elites. In North Africa, AU influence is almost non-existent. And in Central Africa, the collapse of French-backed regimes has left a vacuum no one is rushing to fill. The AU's authority isn't being toppled, it's being quietly bypassed. And the danger is this: if the Union doesn't adapt fast, it may not fall with a bang. It may fade with a whisper. So what does adaptation even look like? It begins with one hard truth: the AU can no longer afford to be neutral in a battle for Africa's soul. It must choose whether to remain a gatekeeper for an old order or become a vessel for the new one that the Sahel is demanding. That means shedding its reliance on foreign donors who expect conditional diplomacy. That means creating real rapid response teams that don't just monitor crises, but intervene when people are bleeding. That means decentralizing power, empowering sub-regional alliances, and embracing states that speak the language of urgency, not just protocol. The listening mission to Burkina Faso was a test run, a soft entry into a hard reality. But listening is only the first step. The next is action. And action, in this new era, cannot be a conference in a hotel. It has to be infrastructure, strategy, boots, budgets, and above all, courage. Because if the AU hesitates any longer, it may wake up one day to a continent united, just not under its flag. The Sahel didn't break the AU, but it exposed just how thin its grip truly is. So now the clock is ticking. Can the African Union rise to meet this rebellion of purpose? Or has the center already shifted beyond its reach? The African Union stands at the edge of a precipice. The ground beneath it isn't crumbling from outside attack, but from a quiet refusal. A refusal by some of its most embattled member states to wait any longer. The question is no longer, will the AU lead? The question now is, can it even catch up? Because the Sahel has already moved on. What we are witnessing is not just rebellion, it is reconstruction. What began as isolated coups is now forging a blueprint that challenges every single assumption the AU was founded on. For decades, unity meant consensus, patience, and compromise. But Burkina Faso and its allies are betting on something different: urgency, independence, and self-defined order. And here's the uncomfortable truth: they might be right. The institutions that promised to protect Africa's post-colonial borders have largely failed to protect its people. The bodies that vowed to speak for the continent have, more often than not, spoken in the language of donor dependence and diplomatic delay. And in the void, a new model is taking shape. One that doesn't wait for global approval or continental applause. One that is brutal, fast, sometimes messy, but undeniably African in its agency. Now the African Union faces its most defining moment since its birth. Either it becomes a flexible, ground-level institution that adapts to the realities of fractured sovereignties and self-built coalitions, or it becomes a symbol of what Africa tried and outgrew. It can no longer simply balance between tradition and change. It must choose sides in the new African paradigm, and that choice comes with consequences. If the AU embraces this new energy erupting from the Sahel, if it recognizes Traoré, Goïta, and others not as deviants but as innovators of a new African pragmatism, it will need to tear up its old rulebook. It will have to reimagine governance as something rooted in performance, not imported procedures. It will have to measure legitimacy not by the calendar of elections, but by the strength of community resilience and military defense of sovereignty. But if it clings to the past, insisting on processes that no longer resonate with large swaths of the continent, it risks watching those same regions walk away entirely. And not just politically, economically, strategically, ideologically. The Sahel is already turning its face toward Asia, strengthening ties with Russia, opening doors to alternative development financing, and floating the idea of building parallel diplomatic frameworks. If that vision expands, and countries like Guinea, Chad, and even the Central African Republic continue aligning, the African Union may find itself standing alone in the center, while the rest of the continent forms a new ring around it. That wouldn't just be a diplomatic failure. That would be a foundational collapse. Do you think AU should compromise, or should the African nations do what it says?